Thank you very much for your comments. And it's now time to turn it over to our audience for their questions or perhaps comments for Tom and Mr. Wolf. And so if I could have the first question.
So our first question from Rosemary McCartney is, the speakers are rightly raising solutions as relational or relationship building rather than institutional or new institution building. Is this an accurate assessment? So while there's much focus on China and Russia, very similar issues will determine our future US relations regardless of election outcomes. We are on very different value and norm tracks.
Martin, would you like to start off on that, about comment about the institutional structure, which you certainly seem to suggest in your comments was very much under threat, but have you got any ideas about how we might see new or better institutions?
So first of all, my thinking on this question has evolved and is evolving. But this is sort of where I see things at the moment. I would rather like to avoid it being either or, in the sense that you either have institutions or relations. But if it has to be either or, it seems to be pretty clear you start with relations. I mean, if you can't talk to somebody and you'd really rather fight a war with them, institutions aren't going to do you much good. The story of the League of Nations is probably well known by us all. So institutions which are not underpinned by a commitment of relevant parties, and they always vary, but so globally this would be nation states predominantly, which are not underpinned by the commitment of the relevant parties to the values and objectives of those institutions, which must necessarily include a commitment to working with others and compromising with them. That's part of an international institution, inevitably, and to allowing it to perform its executive functions if it has them in a reasonably neutral way. If these relations don't, if these underpinning relationships don't exist, they don't work. One beautiful example is the World Trade Organization. There's been a lot of complaints over the years from critics of the World Trade Organization that it violated sovereignty. And for smaller countries, I'll come to this in a second, it to some degree did. But essentially the WTO was no more than a way of encoding and making predictable the commitments that major states, most states actually, were prepared to make to one another. It worked in this respect, in making those commitments real and predictable, only to the extent the major states were prepared and willing to abide by those commitments and believed in them. And it's not a great mystery that recently neither of the two superpowers have. So the WTO is an empty shell. So it's not just relationships, it's commitments to the underlying ideas that are embodied in the institution in question that are necessary condition. And I'll just give one final example, which was already mentioned by the second speaker, which is the environment. We got the Paris Accord. I won't discuss the details of the Paris Accord. It's an institutional framework with commitments. And it is now, in my view, essentially dead. It's not completely dead, but it's essentially dead because one of the most important parties has withdrawn because they don't like the commitments. And the other parties that matter think, well, if the US is not doing anything, why on earth should we? So it starts which is why I started with what's going on domestically in the West. I didn't talk about China. I could have had a very long discussion of that. But yes, it starts with the international order is a relationship of states. It is always a relationship of states. You could imagine it being something else, but it isn't where we are. And therefore it exists and functions in ways that states determine, and particularly important states. And right at the moment, they can't function well together because they disagree too much on fundamental issues, which the international order requires them to agree on.
Well,
I'll
thank
dovetail on what Martin just said and give the example of the United States and Great Britain breaking the international order. It's extraordinary to me to read the news coming out for the past few days with regard to the chief legal officers in Great Britain resigning because Mr. Johnson has simply decided that he's not going to obey international law with regard to trade. It's the same thing that's happened in the United States. We mentioned the new NAFTA and the fact that it actually contains some things that progressives have been fighting for a long time. But almost the day after the thing was signed, the ink wasn't even dry yet. And the trade representative was saying, oh, by the way, we find that Canada's just selling too much aluminum these days, and we're going to go after that. Again, breaking the agreement that they had just signed. The question was asked in the Q&A. There was a question from Mike Perry saying that beyond talking, what can we do on issues of human rights? And I would actually put the environment and future generations on that plane with regard to their right to live in a clean environment and to prosper and to have a world with biodiversity. So what can we do? Well, I think part of the answer came out over the weekend when France and Germany were announcing that they were no longer going to pursue negotiations with Mercosur, this large trading bloc in South America, one of the key components of which is Brazil, because of the willful destruction of the Amazon rainforest. And there's now pressure on Canada to follow suit. The first reaction in Canada has been a classic shop-worn one with, well, let's make an agreement with them and then we'll change it from the inside. That's not going to work with somebody like Bolsonaro any more than that would work with Trump. And that, I think, is part of the New World Order that Martin Wolf is describing, because this type of behavior in the West, where democracy, respect for rights, those institutions that accompany that, have always been cherished. But you have a US president who goes in front of the cameras and says that a free press is the enemy of the American people, and there are quite a few Americans willing to believe that right now. That's been one of the biggest challenges in the world that we're in today. Everybody gets their own news source. They believe that they've done research if they read 3 blogs by climate change deniers, COVID-19 deniers. And it's one of the toughest things that we have to do in the world today. My concern is that the very underpinnings of democracy in our own countries are things that we've taken for granted over the years. And we can see just the damage being wrought in a few short years south of the border, and the recent troubling information coming out of Britain. So it was one thing to talk about, oh, you know, Hungary's got a very right-wing government, doesn't respect the basic tenets of democracy, and it's true. But now we're starting to see that in those pillars of the world order with regard to democracies, much is being lost, and democracy itself is very much under attack as a result.
Well, thank you both very much. I think Martin's point about the need for the great powers to be actively involved in institutions in positive ways to make them work is so accurate. I mean, the Security Council is a perfect example of that. Its failure because of the lack of cooperation or mutual accommodation there amongst the great powers. And I remember personally, when I was a young law professor, being told by American professors who taught international trade law, John Jackson, famous professor, we have to have appropriate dispute resolution clauses in the WTO because, after all these countries around the world are cheating and we have to hold them to account. Well, after the United States lost most of the cases in the WTO, suddenly it's the United States that says, let's get rid of that dispute resolution business because we're the ones that are getting attacked. So if we don't have the cooperation from the beginning from the great powers, the very institutions they've created, how on earth are we going to survive? But we'll now maybe move on to some other comments from others. So maybe, Heather, would you be good enough to read the next question?
Yes, and I'm trying to read them in order now that they came in, so that we can be fair in terms of getting questions out. So the second question, Neville Nicol asked, would panelists please comment on the proposition that globalization is collapsing, now rapidly accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis? John Ralston Saul said recently that we've shifted from a world that in recent decades had fewer hard borders for trade, services, and people movement to one in which hard borders are everywhere, not just between countries, but also religions. What does that mean for the future of Canada's growth in civil society?
Thanks, Heather.
Shall I?
So who wants to?
Do you want me to start on that, or I'd be?
By all means, Martin. Yes.
I'd be happy because I seem to start all these time. But so the future of globalization in 5 minutes. Complicated.
Excellent.
Complicated.
You write an article about it.
Yeah. I think it's genuinely complicated. So let me summarize what I think the main points to think about. But the summary is, of course, we are in a backlash phase. So if you think about globalization broadly defined, the integration of economies and societies economically, I'll just focus on the economics. There are many aspects of that, but I will include in the economics one aspect, which is not really economics or mainly, which is the movement of people, migration. It's sort of driven very crudely by two things. And it's very important to get these separate and to get them clear. The first is technological developments, because they shape what is possible. And obviously in the last couple of centuries, we've had colossal improvements and transformations, but they've come across on top of millennia of it in improvements in our capacities for long distance transport and communications. And that's a fundamental driver. The 19th century and early 20th century, in my view, was more revolutionary than the 20th and 21st century on those two dimensions. We can discuss that at great length, but it's not important. The point is, it's continued. In the current era, the dominant technological changes have been, of course, in communications, not transport. Our transport technologies are remarkably old, but the communications technologies self-evidently are not. That's very clear. And then overriding on top of that is politics, the will to integrate, which reflects political relations and internally, the things I talked about, and externally. And if we look at the last 150 years, roughly speaking, we're now in the fourth phase. The first phase was a globalization era in the age of empire. The second stage was a globalization collapse in the age of great power conflict. The Second World War ended that. Then we've got essentially the Pax Americana, which first integrated the West and then the world. And that ended, in my view, in 2007. And now we're in another transition period, which looks as though it's going to be quite as bad as the first transition period, which was very bad. So in this transition period that we've been in since 2007, the following things are identifiable. There's a clear backlash against migration everywhere, and a very serious attempt to halt it. Migration, interestingly, international migration never got close to being as big in our period as it was in the late 19th century. The proportion of people living in countries other than the ones in which they were born is only 3% worldwide. It was over 10 in the late 19th, early 20th century. So migration backlash. Trade has stabilized, but until COVID-19, it didn't collapse. Basically, trade relationship, it's not true that we have reversed all our commitments, but the general tendency is protectionist, but it hasn't collapsed. Trading goods, I mean. I won't talk about the drivers of it. The movement of finance has reversed in important ways, but not in all respects. The peak was clearly 2007. The movement of finance capital. And finally, there's the movement of ideas. And ideas are floating across the world with staggering speed, except in China, where they, of course, have created their own walls. So it's important to separate out these elements. It's not just there are walls. It's more complicated than that. And the politics of this are more complicated. Now, what do I think is going to come next? That's the final comment. Here I'm going to be heroic because we really don't know. I think trade in goods will contract and will go regional. I think the US is durably protectionist. I think it will try and reverse integration with China. We've already heard this. And Europe will follow suit. So we'll have North American trade. Europe vis-a-vis North America is not clear to me. It depends on who's the next president. But relations with China are going to break down, and that is going to force countries all over the world to choose which system they're going to be part of. The Western-based system or the Chinese-based system. And this will not just be trade in goods. I'll next get to the next stage. It's going to be regulatory structures, which will definitely go above nations. And I suspect we're going to move into 3 regulatory zones: North American, European, and Chinese. And finally, I think we're going to see an explosion of virtual globalization, of which if everybody can work from home, they can work from home anywhere, and they can be employed anywhere. And you don't think firms have worked this out by now? They have. So I don't think we're going to be able to stop the globalization, virtual globalization, unless we go Chinese. So it's a very, very complicated picture, but big chunks of the globalization we experienced are going, and there are going to be very big changes in how it's going to work in the next 10, 20 years, but it's not going to be stopped. It's unstoppable. The technology is too powerful, simply too powerful to prevent integration of our societies across the world.
Thank you very much. Then, for Heather, would you be good enough to read out the next question then?
Yes. The UN is endorsing the UN 75 Declaration this month, which reaffirms the UN and multilateralism, excuse me. The discussion today has highlighted the importance of a stable international order. It was also raised that Canada can export our values and human rights. What do you think Canada needs and can do on the international stage more than just sign or endorse?
Thank you. Well, Tom, why don't we go to you first for some ideas from a Canadian perspective, and then we can let Martin weigh in from a broader perspective.
Thanks, Bill. We often tease ourselves as being, sort of the Dudley Do-Rights, the ones who do have these ideals. But I think that is part of the Canadian difference, and indeed part of the Canadian toolbox, as William Macdonald says in the book that we're discussing today. It's this ability to use that as the underpinning for our approach around the world. But we've got to be consistent. If it's clear today that we would never allow the importation of a product, and it could easily be banned if it was the result of slave labor. It becomes more slippery with regard to child labor because there are questions of enforcement and definition and the ability to inspect, but that's also an ideal. But what do you do when you learn that in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh that hundreds of women were killed in a factory that should never have been used at that point, and their conditions could fairly have been described as being almost that, slave-like? That really becomes the toughest question in all of this. We've talked about the Uyghur in China. Is it possible then to understand Mr. O'Toole's position when he says, of course there will be trade with China, but there'd be no question of establishing a level playing field, a full-blown trade agreement with a country that is so consistently breaching the fundamental rules of human rights. These are tough discussions because, of course, in Martin Wolf's description of it, North America, I would have to say, would probably be North and South America, would be the Americas, and Europe as another massive trading bloc, but all of that pales in comparison to Asia, to China, just China and India together. But the influence that is being constructed in the most literal sense right now by China, as they're building this belt and road system throughout the world, increasing its influence, the temptation is going to remain the one that brought Donald Trump to power. Oh, well, they've got Putin in Russia. He's a strong man. I'm putting that into quotes. Bolsonaro follows in the same mold. We had the same thing going on in the Philippines. Is that the new world order, where people look at the success of China economically and say, well, some of these democratic ideals are pie in the sky. They don't hold water in this day and age. We've got to step up to the plate and start playing it by these new rules. And I think that something fundamental will have been lost. It's not just the war dead and everything that we've been through to try to have a world where people get to decide the government that they're going to have, and it's not the government that decides what type of life you're going to have. I don't think that should be lost, and I think that any negotiation that Canada does in the future, we should take the lead in saying that these questions of workers' rights, environmental rights, the rights of future generations, and the fundamental human rights, these are all going to have to be part and parcel. Otherwise, why sign that type of deal? I would try to summarize it by saying that when you have a free trade deal, implicitly you're saying, I see you. I see you as an equal. I see you as somebody that reflects the type of values that I want to have. And because that goes into everything you make in your country. And if we're going to be able to trade freely, then there has to be some basic respect for rights. And I think that so much will be lost if that doesn't get put back on the table, because right now I don't think it's central to any of these discussions.
Thank you, Tom. Martin, could we ask you for your comment?
So we know Larry Diamond, very well-known scholar of democracy, has described where we're in, what we're in is a democratic recession. And this has been going on now for about 1.5 decades. And we continue to be in this recession. This was exactly the starting point for my book. Now, in the 80s, but even more 90s and early noughties, we thought democracy was sweeping the world. And this has turned out to be a very serious mistake. So we are embattled. And that's the first point. And the values Tom, I think, mentioned are not, they may well be universally shared by human beings, but they're not universally shared by governments and states. And the second point is crucial, that there's been very serious erosion of belief in our own system within our own societies. And that's reflected, may not be true in Canada, in which case I congratulate you, but I think it's true almost everywhere else. And I've discussed that also in my book. It's very, very clear. And it's most dramatic in the US and slightly less dramatic in the UK, as has been pointed out, because these are fundamental assaults on the basis of liberal democracy, which is, as is pointed out, a great deal more than just voting. It's human rights. It's the rule of law. These are big things, and we've lost belief in them. And as a result, our own world is sort of shattering. So then that raised the question, well, what can we do about it? Or what can Canada do about it? Well, I'm afraid you can set an example, which is a very good thing to do, but Canada on its own is not going to do much. And I'm not terribly optimistic, but it seems to me you have to start by creating alliances of countries that see the world in similar ways and believe in these values. I am still hopeful that this will include the UK and the US, because it would make a difference. If the West as a whole can unite around these values, then we still have, at least at the moment, resources and capacity to influence the world very profoundly in these respects. So that seems to me the first necessary order of business. And the second one, and I ended my remarks with this, and I really think it's difficult, really, really difficult, is to decide how we relate to countries which are immensely important and powerful. You know, let's suppose, and I'll just discuss one example. You talked about human rights, and I agree with you, they're very important issues. The environment, climate change. China is far and away the world's biggest emitter. If we don't reach an agreement with China on its emission strategy, we're not going to do anything useful about climate change. Do you think you're going to bully China? Do you think there is any policy we can reasonably hope to follow in the West which will force China to do what we want if it really doesn't want to do it? I don't think so. I don't think so. And certainly not a policy I would favor. So we would have to, what we have to do is construct a system of relationships in which we make very clear what our priorities and positions are. We impose sanctions. I have no problem with this, but we have to recognize that in the end, we have to agree on the things that are absolutely crucial to us and agree on where we're going to differ, because accommodation will mean accommodating, living with people, at least not fighting wars with people, at least reaching agreement on global challenges with people that we actually abhor. I would remind you this famous remark, I think, of Winston Churchill during the Second World War, when people criticized him for allying with Joseph Stalin against Hitler. I think I've got this right, but if not, I apologize. I would ally with the devil himself if that would help me to defeat the Nazis. I haven't got the quote right. Well, I'm afraid we are going to have to cooperate with China a lot. It's not going to go away, and it's not going to become a Western democracy.
And sorry, Tom, I believe you wanted to.
I just wanted to look at a tiny detail with regard to the Paris Accord. As we mentioned before, the U.S. is simply withdrawn.
Right.
Canada is still part of it, but as Julie Gelfand, our much respected Commissioner of Sustainable Development, mentioned in her last report, we have absolutely no plan to respect the Paris Accord. And last year, in the most recently published statistics, Canada is the country in the G20 that produces the greatest greenhouse gases per capita. So that's not a gold medal that we're very proud of. And it's fair is fair. In this discussion, we have to mention that China has made a monumental effort and is in fact on track to meet its Paris Accord obligations. It doesn't mean that they're not still producing a great amount. Of course, they are. But they have self-interest as well, because the air had simply become unbreathable in a lot of their major cities.
Oh, thank you very much. So Heather, I'd ask you if you read the next question. Why don't you pose the two questions at once then?
Yeah, okay. So one from Jeff Nackaville. It says, Bill, congratulations on this excellent wise book. My question coming tonight this morning, okay, from my study in Hong Kong is this. In several places, you suggest that our assessment of China's future will depend greatly on how China's current leadership handles Hong Kong and the One China, Two Systems framework. In the short time since you made your last updates to the book, China has taken decisive action on Hong Kong. What might this mean for our assessment of China's future now? And that is the one question. I guess, yes, we could take the two together, although they're quite different. And the other question from Peter Mansbridge. About a month ago, Martin offered the opinion that it's too early in many ways to tell whether populism's future is in danger because of COVID-19. A month is not a long time, but this past month has seen a lot. Even the last 24 hours has seen a lot. Underlying in a way Martin's theory that some populist governments don't even want to govern. Has Martin's big picture view changed at all in a month? And where's Tom on this central question?
Oh, well, thank you very much. Who would like to go first on Hong Kong, which
I'll
really
leave it
seemed to be posed to
Martin.
Bill Macdonald, but we'll let you panelists answer it.
I
Sorry?
think it's becoming very, very clear what Xi Jinping's theory of China is. It's become clearer and clearer over the last year. He is absolutely committed to the restoration of China as a great power. He is absolutely committed to the idea of the unitary sovereignty of China, which obviously explains Hong Kong. And I think even more interestingly, he's absolutely committed to what I personally consider to have been the civilizational project of China over the millennia, which is to turn everybody into a Han Chinese person because they simply forgotten that they were ever anything else, and they used to be. It is not the case that this was one ethnicity with one culture several thousand years ago. They forged it, and they're doing it again. That seems to me what's happening with the Uyghurs. We don't like any of this stuff. It's deeply alien and horrible. And finally, it's clear that he wishes to make this entity not only unitary sovereignty under his control, but an enormous global power, the decisive global power. So if we don't take this seriously, then we're not taking anything seriously. The problem is, as I've said, I don't think we can deal with this except by being united. And the civilizational project of the US at the moment is to shatter the West. That makes it rather difficult to deal with China intelligently. So that's what I feel about that. The second one, was populism. Now, this is really interesting to me. Referring to a video I did, it's 4 minutes extempore, so it's not too serious. But essentially the idea is, do publics in democracies care if their government is just totally uninterested in governing? I mean, we've seen these wonderful quotes from Woodward's book in the last few days. It's perfectly clear, everybody knows this, that people like Bolsonaro and Trump, and to a significant extent Johnson, are not interested in governing. They're interested in the performance of power. Masha Gessen's wonderful expression. Do publics care about that? Well, I put forward the optimistic view, but has it changed? We'll have to see in the elections. That maybe people actually, when they've gone through something like COVID-19, would like to have a government that's interested in governing. And in which case, maybe these populists who've come up against the reality of their indifference, the consequence of their indifference to government, will be disposed of and will be replaced by people who are actually interested in governing. However, there was a warning in that. My warning was there are two sorts of people that people might choose if they've decided they want somebody to govern. One is a competent Democrat. And Angela Merkel, who's a competent Democrat, is incredibly popular in Germany right now because the government has worked well. And the other possibility, of course, is not a clown dictator, but a serious one. Somebody who actually is interested in governing with a boot, which isn't Trump. Oh, thank God. I mean, he might be interested, but anyway, that's my view. It's not Johnson. It is Viktor Orban. And it's certainly, though he's not very competent, it is Putin, and for sure it's Xi Jinping. So the question is, does the public in this situation move back to democracy, proper democracy with sensible grown-up leaders, or does it go for serious dictators? And we've been there before. That was the world of the 30s.
I think that Martin has hit the nail right on the head. And the question is, what lesson is being gleaned as people watch the police, the Chinese police, bearing down on the crowds and the protesters in Hong Kong? What message is being captured when China continues to oppress, imprison, and put in, for all intents and purposes, concentration camps, its Uyghur Muslim minority? What lesson is learned in Myanmar? Why, as you see hundreds of thousands of people fleeing across the border into Bangladesh at Cox's Bazar, and something akin to Srebrenica has been taking place on the other side, where all of a sudden the male population is just not there anymore. We can only guess at the horrors that have taken place. What's the lesson that's being learned? And this whole strong man approach, again, I put that in quotes, but that whole approach seems to be on the rise. There's a downside to the communications aspect that Martin correctly defined before. We are way ahead in terms of communication. The downside is that people are free to take the information that they want, but there's no common discourse anymore. There's no way to guide people. And that plays out in strange ways. You can try to tell people that there's a hole in the ozone layer. They get together within just a couple of years, and lo and behold, you get the Montreal Accord to deal with CFCs because people can see that. They understand what that means. You try to tell them that global warming is going to make the planet unlivable for their great-grandchildren, and they're going to just go, well, that doesn't affect me today. So this is the same thing with regard to these democratic institutions. People see a big, strong China. I don't think China has to do anything to be a world leader in terms of its economic and military force. It's already there. And it's been flexing its muscle even with regard to the Americans in the South China Sea. The Americans have not dared touch any of the Chinese claims so far. So this is the future. This is what we're looking at. Are we going to see a withering and a breaking away of some of the most fundamental things that we have built up over the past couple of centuries in terms of allowing people to decide for themselves, to dispose of their own destiny? Or are we looking at a Pax China that is going to impose itself on a good swath of the world with very little ability to answer it because of that very military, but more importantly, economic might?
Well, thank you very much. And Heather, I think this would be an appropriate time then to end this panel and to thank our two panelists for really remarkable contributions. Tom, thank you very much. Martin, thank you very much for your tremendous contributions and your insights. And thank you to each and every one of those who've been good enough to pose questions. And we'll now take a short break, and we'll come back for the next panel, which we look forward to.